Hey, APWorlders. This is your communism in the Cold War. World communism posed a profound military and political/ideological threat to the Western world of capitalism and democracy. This prompted a global rivalry between the United States and USSR. The last 2 decades of the 20th century witnessed the collapse of communist regimes and the abandonment of communist principles. Russia was the first to change to communism, and by 1970, almost a third of the world lived in communist countries. Other areas that became communist, besides for China, included Mongolia, some Eastern European areas that were extensions of the Soviet Union, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, and Afghanistan. These places were linked, first, by having a shared common ideology that derived from Marxism, and second, they looked forward to an international revolution. They want that this revolution become worldwide. They would form, the majority of these communist countries would form a pact. It was called the Warsaw Pact. And that united the Soviet Union and the Eastern European communist states. So if you look here in red, here's Europe. All right, here's the Eastern European countries that became communists. All right, and so that was part of the Warsaw Pact. And then the counter to this Warsaw Pact was NATO, and that was the capitalist countries alliance, in which they made a pact against the communist states. Both sides also formed economic treaties to work together as well to try to defeat the other. All right, so you can look at some of those other communist areas, right? We got Mongolia, and we have Laos, Cambodia, right? Vietnam, those areas that we mentioned earlier. You got North Korea, you have China, all right, and then also there were communist groups around that tried to come into power. You see where the X's are. All right, most of these places where the X's are, especially here in Latin America, is where the United States would intervene to stop these communist guerrilla groups from gaining power and becoming communist countries. The only area you can see where we really didn't stop it was Cuba. All right. And then you can see also here was at Panama. All right, one other group to note is these gray areas. All right, these are going to be non-aligned areas. Those are going to be countries that aren't going to go with either side. All right, but as you can see from this map, the majority of the world basically had to pick a side. They were either on NATO's side or they were on the Warsaw side. All right, they either supported capitalism and democracy or they supported communism. All right, let's review the Russian Revolution first. Communism came during the upheaval in 1917. World War I, which went very badly for Russia, was the catalyst to this revolution. Russia was embarrassed and humiliated during World War I, and so the people, the time was right for the communist group to take over. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had lost almost all his support and was forced to leave the throne after the embarrassment of World War I. A radical group called the Bolsheviks, a small socialist party that was led by Lenin, was able to come to power in all this chaos. They called for an end to the war. They wanted to give land to the peasants and give the workers control of factories. And they wanted self-determination for non-Russians. The Bolsheviks had to fight off opponents within Russia and abroad to keep their power. But by 1921, they had victory. After World War II, the United States tried to stop their growth by implementing the Marshall Plan. That was an attempt to stop the spread of communism in Europe. However, Lenin, sensing that, he installed full communist governments of people that were loyal to himself in areas such as Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. All right, and they were backed and pressured by the Soviet army. All right, take a look and make sure you read through this, kind of give you a little bit more background about the Russian Revolution flow. All right, now we look at China. In China, communism triumphed in China in 1949. All right, so it was later than Russia. But similar to Russia, it was on the heels of war and domestic upheaval. However, the Chinese Revolution was a struggle of decades rather than a single year like Russia. The Chinese dynasty system collapsed in 1911 under the pressure of foreign imperialism and its own inadequacies and internal opposition. So remember, like all those events that we studied last, like the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars, things like that, right? So that's what caused China to collapse. The first communist group rose in China in 1921. All right, but over the next 28 years, this group would grow, and they would find a leader in Mao Zedong. And in 1949, he emerged victorious as the ruler of China. This was a surprising result because the Communist Party defeated the Kuomintang group, or the Nationalist Party, which governed China for 20 years after the collapse of the empire system. Chiang Kai-shek was the party's leader, and he had made modest improvements, but these improvements only affected the cities and rural areas where most people lived were impoverished. But rural areas where most of the people lived was impoverished. So Chinese communists gained support from the country's peasants, where Russia was from the workers. All right, so that was a big difference between the two. So China kind of focused on the peasants and the poor farmers to get the revolution through, where Russia was more focused on the workers. All right, but then Japan's going to invade China, and that's going to be what gives Mao an opening to come to power. All right, so here you can see how to spell Chiang Kai-shek's name, who was the leader before this, if you were wondering. All right. Building socialism. This meant first modernizing and industrializing. All right. Second, in order to build socialism in your country, they had to promote the values of selflessness and collectivism to end the inequalities. All right. So when the people stop thinking of themselves and think more of what's important for the state, not their own individual benefit. The states controlled the entire economy and political authorities. They ensured the arts, education, and the media conformed to improved ways of thinking. Mass organizations for women, workers, students, and professional groups operated. And fourth, communist movements pioneered forms of women's rights that was only adopted by the West later. Communist feminism was largely state-directed and included rights for divorce and property ownership for women. Both China and the Soviet Union redistributed the land to peasants, all right, which you can see in these top two pictures. In China, they both enacted, a collectivization agriculture. All right, so it was not private ownership of farms, but like a collectivization where you would take the agriculture products and then redistribute it out equally to everybody. In China, this was known as the Great Leap Forward. And due to the Communist Party roots with farmers, this collectivization was peaceful. But in Russia, where peasants were now forced into these collective farms, the violence was great. Some were killed, some were sent out to Siberia who tried to resist. All right. In both areas, though, this system did not work. In Russia, a terrible famine ensued, and some 5 million people died of starvation and malnutrition. In China, a combination of administrative problems and bad weather produced a massive famine that killed 20 million people there. Both countries also focused on industrialization. They would create the they believed it would create the economic progress needed and create the military strength to make them a world power. China would follow Russia's model on this. This involves state ownership of property, centralized planning, and do it within these 5-year plans. Priority was in heavy industry. Both countries had unprecedented economic growth after they did this, and increased literacy rates and greater social mobility for its people. The people also rapidly urbanized, but that urbanization created problems because it put a lot of pressure on the countryside people to provide resources for these people, right, which caused that famine and starvation from those collective farms. In China, they created what was called the Great Leap Forward, and that promoted small-scale industrialization in the rural areas, and it gave widespread and practical technological education for all, rather than just the small elite of experts. But as we know, massive famine happened from the Great Leap Forward as well. Mao tried to do a second campaign, which he called the Cultural Revolution. This attempted to bring healthcare and education to the countryside and try rural industrialization again. That one failed as well, which was a big embarrassment for him. Both groups also spent a lot of time searching for enemies, whether it was people that were part of the pre-revolutionary elites that were against communism, or high-ranking members, and longtime supporters of the Communist Party who they believed had become corrupt. In both countries, they would find those people and they would arrest them and either sentence them to death or hard labor. In the Soviet Union, they would get, they could get sent to these labor camps that were out in Siberia. And in China, this caused a big problem because that was during this Cultural Revolution that Mao started to believe that many of the young people and government officials, teachers were part of this, and that's what caused the Cultural Revolution to fail. Communism brought about a global conflict that's going to restructure international relations. After World War II, this division would erupt into a Cold War. All right, it's called a Cold War because it wasn't ever actual direct fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States, but there was a lot of things behind the scene. The initial area of conflict in the Cold War was over this area here in Eastern Europe. Soviets wanted to control it for security, and the United States and UK wanted to make these countries into democratic societies with ties to capitalism and the world economy. And the result was a rival military alliances that we talked about earlier, NATO and Warsaw. The border between the two, this white line here, became known as the Iron Curtain. All right, and so people that were on the east of the Iron Curtain were communists. People that were on the west were capitalists. The arms race was the most dangerous as well as the most known aspect of the Cold War. As countries emerged from imperialist rules, so they both tried to build up their weapons and get more and more weapons of mass destruction. But as countries emerged from imperialist rule, both sides tried to influence the new regimes that were coming in to make them either capitalist or communist. Some countries, such as India, did non-alignment. Others tried to play each other off of each other for aid and for money. All right, and so the result of these places becoming independent resulted in these proxy wars. All right, make sure you write down what proxy wars were. Two of the biggest proxy wars at this time was the Korean and the Vietnam War. In Korea, it was a communist North Korea that was aided by China against a democratic South Korea, which was aided by the United States. And in what was a 3-year war, the North kind of tried to invade the South, push them back, but in the end, they ended up having the same division that they originally had and still have today. In the Vietnam, it was the South Vietnamese that was a communist group. They're going to be led by a leader named Ho Chi Minh. And the North are going to be anti-communist group. And the South, that were going to be helped by the Soviets and China, and they're going to eventually win. And they're going to unite the country under communism. A third major conflict is going to occur in Afghanistan, where a Marxist group are going to come to power in 1978. The traditional Islamist group there didn't like it, and the Soviet forces tried to intervene to help the communist group come to power. For a full decade, from 1979 to 1989, the war went on, and the U.S. would give aid to the Afghan guerrilla fighters. Russia would eventually withdraw, and the communist regime there would collapse. This was kind of ironic because that same group that we helped, we end up, fighting against now in the Afghan war. But the most potentially damaging Cold War battle occurred in Cuba. Castro, he's going to take control after the United States attempts to oust him. Soviets are going to move nuclear-tipped Soviet missiles to Cuba, causing the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Soviets got Cuba to help them after all these repeated attempts by the United States to kill Fidel Castro. He was going to receive aid from Russia. Alright, so I didn't get everything on the first part because it's 15 minutes. It's up now. So make sure you watch the second part just to finish. Alright, it's almost up.